I raised him for 30 years alone. But what his new wife was planning behind my back. At 67, I believed I understood the true nature of family loyalty. My estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, had sheltered 3 generations of memories, and my son Christopher seemed devoted to preserving our legacy. But when he married Serafina barely 10 days ago, I discovered that some people view love as nothing more than a sophisticated acquisition strategy. I never imagined that answering my mahogany front door would feel like signing my own death warrant. The rain was merciless that October evening, the kind of downpour that transforms windows into percussion instruments and drowns out rational thought. I had just finished arranging fresh orchids in the foyer when the Westminster chimes rang 3 times. I opened the door to find Serafina standing there, radiant in her designer coat, wielding an ivory umbrella like a weapon of conquest. Behind her loomed a nervous man clutching official documents and a notary seal. And there was Christopher, towering over them both, soaked to the bone, yet somehow still radiating the confidence of inherited privilege. The silence between us stretched like a taut wire. "Hello, Catherine," Serafina purred, her voice dripping with manufactured sweetness as she brushed past me uninvited. "We've brought everything necessary to finalize the property arrangements. I thought we'd handle this efficiently, without unnecessary complications." The audacity was breathtaking. She spoke as if my grandfather's estate, the home where I'd raised Christopher alone after the tragedy, was already hers to distribute. I felt my blood crystallize in my veins, but I maintained the composure that 4 decades of high society had trained into my bones. "The property arrangements?" I asked, my voice steady as surgical steel. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me rattled. I stepped aside, allowing them entry into the grand foyer. Serafina marched directly into the library as if she'd already memorized the floor plan. Christopher followed, but his silence spoke volumes about his complicity. On my antique writing desk, Serafina spread several official-looking documents with theatrical precision. The property deeds sat prominently on top. She looked up at me with those calculating eyes, the same ones that had fooled me into believing she genuinely loved my son. "There's substantial paperwork to review, but everything is standard procedure. It's wise to handle these matters promptly, especially with the current market volatility. Don't you agree?" I remained motionless, studying her performance. I didn't raise my voice, didn't tremble, didn't even blink. Instead, I offered her a smile so cold it could have frozen champagne mid-pour. She had orchestrated this ambush expecting to find a sentimental old woman who would crumble under pressure and sign whatever they placed before her. But Serafina had fundamentally misunderstood who she was dealing with. I approached the desk with deliberate calm, my hands steady as a surgeon's as I lifted the top document. My eyes scanned the fraudulent power of attorney agreement that Serafina had clearly fabricated with some corrupt legal accomplice. The forgery was sophisticated but not perfect. My name was typed above a signature that bore no resemblance to my actual hand. I looked directly at Christopher. He couldn't meet my gaze. "I never authorized this documentation," I said quietly, "and you both know it." Serafina's perfect smile flickered for just an instant, but I caught that flash of pure avarice, that momentary slip that revealed her true nature. "Well, perhaps not formally yet, but this represents the preliminary framework. We thought we'd present everything comprehensively to streamline the process for you," she said, as if she were performing some magnificent charitable act. Outside, thunder rolled across the Connecticut hills like artillery fire. I folded the papers with surgical precision and slid them back across the polished surface. "Tell me, Serafina," I said, turning my full attention to her, "is this why you married him?" "For this house." Her composure shattered then, only for a heartbeat, but I witnessed it. The mask slipped, revealing the calculating predator beneath the designer facade. Christopher finally found his voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "We simply thought perhaps it was time you considered downsizing, Mother. This estate is enormous for one person, and you might prefer something more manageable. And you want it." I finished for him. He didn't deny it. The silence was his confession. Serafina's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You're making this far more complicated than necessary." "No," I said, moving toward the kitchen with deliberate calm. "I'm simply not making it easy." As they sat there waiting for the devastated, weeping widow they expected to bulldoze, I took my time preparing Earl Grey tea. Let them feel the storm approaching, because this wasn't the ambush they had planned. This was the opening move in my war. Have you ever trusted someone so completely that their betrayal felt like having your soul surgically removed while you were still conscious? That's exactly what I experienced 4 days earlier, standing at the back of the Four Seasons ballroom, watching Christopher marry a woman I had desperately wanted to believe was genuine. Serafina possessed that luminous quality that all successful manipulators cultivate, the kind that tricks everyone into mistaking calculation for compassion. I remember her embracing me just before the ceremony, whispering, "You've raised such an extraordinary, generous man. I'm so grateful he's mine now. God forgive me." I believed her completely. That evening, I smiled radiantly for every photograph, toasted with vintage crystal, and held my breath as they cut the seven-tier cake. I even pulled Serafina aside during the reception to tell her how profoundly happy I was that Christopher had found someone who seemed to cherish him authentically. She looked genuinely moved, even grateful. Now I understand that was her audition performance. My estate, the one they attempted to steal, sits majestically in Greenwich's most exclusive enclave, where the streets still remember when old money built lasting legacies. A sprawling Tudor revival mansion in sage green with cream trim, slightly weathered by decades but proud as a fortress. My grandfather left it to me when he passed, and it remains the only place I have ever felt truly invulnerable. Every corner holds sacred memories. Christopher's first fever, his first steps, the dent in the carved banister from when he rode a laundry basket down the marble staircase and crashed into the wall. When he was 7, he once told me, "I want to live here forever, Mother." At the time, I believed it was love. Now I wonder if even then, he understood what this property could be worth. After the wedding, the newlyweds didn't even wait a full week before revealing their true agenda. When they returned from their honeymoon in Tuscany, Serafina insisted on bringing her parents over to tour the estate. I thought it was a thoughtful gesture, a way to integrate our families. Instead, her mother spent the afternoon interrogating me about square footage and school district rankings while her father photographed every room with professional thoroughness. Still, I smiled graciously. Still, I prepared a 5-course dinner. Still, I played the perfect hostess, because what else do you do when your child invites wolves to your table and calls them family? It wasn't until the following morning, after they had departed, that I allowed myself to acknowledge what had been gnawing at my consciousness all along. This wasn't about family bonding. It was about asset acquisition. My home, the very sanctuary that had protected them, had become nothing more than a prize in their game. And yet, I remained perfectly composed, not because I wasn't seething with rage, but because I already knew exactly where this path would lead. They didn't understand who I was. They assumed I was sentimental, that my silence indicated agreement, that kindness made me vulnerable. But this estate doesn't belong to them. It never will. The morning after the wedding, I found myself in the hallway outside the guest suite when Serafina's voice drifted through the partially open door like poison disguised as perfume. "So, when do we liquidate the house?" she whispered. There was a pause, the soft rustling of expensive silk sheets. Perhaps she thought I was safely out of earshot. "It's just sitting there accumulating value," she continued with breathtaking audacity. "Do you realize what a property like this would command in today's market? We could invest the proceeds, perhaps flip something more modern, or move into one of those gorgeous new developments in Manhattan. I mean, realistically, how much longer does she need all this space anyway?" I couldn't hear Christopher's response. Maybe he didn't give one. Maybe that silence was his answer. I stood motionless for what felt like eternity, one hand resting against the silk wallpaper, the other clutching a monogrammed linen napkin I had intended to return to the laundry. That phrase, "liquidate the house," kept echoing in my mind as if I were nothing more than a final obstacle, as if my existence were merely an inconvenient delay in their business plan. I wanted desperately to believe she was just speaking carelessly, swept up in the excitement of new marriage, dreaming aloud. That's what I whispered to myself throughout that entire day, even as I prepared her favorite coffee blend and complimented her manicure. But the chill remained, settling into my bones like winter fog. Later that afternoon, Christopher and Serafina descended the grand staircase together. She was wrapped in his silk robe, smiling like a cat who had located the cream and intended to devour every drop. They performed normalcy with Oscar-worthy precision, even displaying affection that seemed genuine to the untrained eye. Serafina asked if we had any oat milk and requested help locating her phone charger. She leaned into me, called me Mother Catherine, and I played along flawlessly because I had already made a crucial decision in the depths of my heart. I would not warn them. I would not confront them. I would not reveal my hand prematurely. Instead, I would listen with surgical precision. I would remember every detail. I would allow them to feel completely secure in their scheme just long enough. That evening, I prepared my tea extra strong and positioned myself by the bay window in the morning room, gazing out at the prize-winning rose garden my grandmother had cultivated before she passed. Every spring, they exploded into magnificent cascades of crimson and ivory, sometimes blush pink if the soil chemistry shifted just right. She used to say, "A woman who controls her own property controls her own peace." The wisdom in those words had never felt more profound. It was drizzling the afternoon. I encountered Serafina's cousin quite by accident. Not a downpour, just that persistent Connecticut mist that soaks through cashmere coats without warning. I was in the gourmet section at Dean and DeLuca, standing between the imported pears and organic arugula, trying to remember if I needed more truffle oil, when I heard someone call my name. Aunt Catherine. I turned, and it took me several seconds to place her. Bianca, I believe. Serafina's cousin from her mother's side, the one with a marketing position at some trendy Manhattan agency and entirely too much bronzer for someone over 30. She rushed over, her designer tote bag swinging dramatically from her arm. "Oh my God, congratulations," she gushed. I smiled politely. "Thank you, dear. On what occasion?" She laughed as if I had made an amusing joke. "On selling the estate, of course. Serafina mentioned you were downsizing. Something about an absolutely incredible offer already on the table. Everyone's been talking about how quickly everything came together." My grip tightened around the sterling silver handle of my shopping basket, but my expression remained perfectly serene. "Excuse me?" She tilted her head, looking confused by my confusion. "Serafina said you were relocating. Something about a really spectacular offer already in negotiation. Everyone's been discussing how rapidly it all developed." I simply stared at her, my mind racing while my face revealed nothing. Bianca didn't seem to notice the silence, or perhaps she mistook it for modesty. She patted my arm condescendingly and said, "Well, I certainly hope you're finding a place with elevator access this time. These old mansions are absolutely gorgeous, but they're brutal on aging knees, aren't they?" She winked, waved, and breezed toward the wine section as if she had just complimented my haircut. I abandoned my basket right there in the aisle. My hands were trembling by the time I reached my Mercedes, not from fear, not even from betrayal, but from pure, crystalline fury. Serafina had already begun speaking, as if my estate were hers to liquidate, as if I had already agreed to their scheme, as if the contracts had been signed and I had simply forgotten to attend my own dispossession. I didn't drive home immediately. I sat there in the parking lot, my fingers clenched around the leather steering wheel, staring at the fog accumulating on the windshield, and then I began making phone calls. I contacted Harrison, an old friend from the country club whose son worked in luxury real estate. I gave him Serafina's name and asked if she had reached out to his firm. He returned my call within 45 minutes. "Yes," he said, his voice tight with concern. "She claimed to have power of attorney for you. They've already begun pulling comparable sales data and scheduled a property evaluation for next Tuesday." My blood transformed into liquid nitrogen. Power of attorney. She was forging legal documents with my name attached. That evening, I opened the antique cedar chest in the guest suite closet, the one that housed my grandmother's jewelry collection, the family Bible, and the worn leather portfolio containing the original deed to the estate. My name, Catherine Wellington Ashford, was inscribed clearly at the top. Sole owner, no cosigners, no liens, no authority granted to anyone else. I sat on the Persian rug with the portfolio in my lap, the thunder outside barely audible over my hammering heartbeat. It was one thing to gossip behind my back about hypothetical scenarios. It was entirely another to walk into a real estate office impersonating me with fraudulent documentation. That was federal fraud, and I would not allow it to continue. But still, I didn't call Serafina. I didn't confront Christopher. I didn't march over to their suite and demand explanations. Not yet. Because now I possess something far more powerful than confrontation. I had evidence, and I was going to allow them to walk directly into their own trap. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was afraid. I wasn't. But because I had never felt more electrically awake in my entire life. The following morning, I made an appointment with my attorney, Victoria Blackwood. We had known each other for 25 years, ever since she helped settle my grandmother's complicated estate. She's brilliant, discreet, and doesn't even blink when faced with family betrayal. By noon, we were sitting in her corner office overlooking Central Park, the storm from the previous evening still painting streaks across the autumn sky. "They're bluffing," she said, flipping through the deed and the living trust I had brought. "If they actually submitted anything bearing a forged power of attorney's signature, they've committed multiple felonies." Plain and simple. I nodded calmly. "What can we implement immediately?" She smiled without an ounce of warmth. "We can implement quite a lot. First, we updated my will with surgical precision. Then we reviewed every title and legal document related to the property. I added an ironclad clause preventing any future transfer without court-supervised review, just in case they attempted any additional fraudulent maneuvers. Finally, I opened a private safe deposit box at Victoria's recommendation. It was time to remove everything of value from the house: birth certificates, insurance policies, jewelry appraisals, investment documents, all of it. It wasn't sufficient to simply prevent them. I needed to know what they were planning before they planned it. So I made a second call, one that Victoria had suggested weeks earlier when I mentioned Serafina's circling behavior. "Contact Sebastian," she had said. "Former federal investigator. Now he specializes in uncovering what people hope will never see daylight." Sebastian Pierce operated from a discreet office in an unmarked building in Midtown. He wore impeccably tailored suits and carried the latest technology, but when he looked at you, he saw everything, every secret, every lie, every carefully constructed facade. "I need to understand exactly what they're planning," I said. "Not theories or speculation. Details. Names, meetings, communications. Everything she's done that involves my property without authorization." He didn't even blink, just wrote something on an iPad with a precision stylus. "Do you want this quiet or traceable?" "Completely quiet," I said. "Absolutely invisible." He nodded. "You'll hear from me within 1 week." That afternoon, I went to my private bank and secured the safe deposit box. I placed the deed, the will, insurance documents, and an empty flash drive inside, waiting for Sebastian's intelligence reports. I transferred the spare house keys to a locked drawer in my antique writing desk. I also made one small but significant change. I removed the family photograph from the living room wall, the one of Christopher and me in front of the rose garden, and replaced it with an ornate mirror. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. Reflection was about to become very important. The following day, I drove to the bank and accessed the deposit box once more, placing every document I had been quietly collecting inside, watching that thick steel door close with a sound like armor clicking into place. I even secured the old family photographs, the ones Serafina had once offered to digitize for the wedding slideshow. I didn't trust her with even copies anymore. When I returned home, the estate was empty, quiet, still mine, and for the first time in weeks, I felt confident it would remain that way. I stood at the base of the marble staircase and looked up, remembering all the years I had carried Christopher in my arms up those steps when he had influenza. The nights I waited at the top for him to sneak in late from prep school parties. How I always left the porch lights on even after he moved out for graduate school, just in case he decided to visit. Those lights had been dark for days now. I didn't feel sadness exactly, just crystalline clarity. They didn't want me here. They wanted what this estate represented. That evening, I changed every lock in the house, quietly and efficiently. Serafina and Christopher still possessed keys from when they stayed during the wedding week. I didn't feel secure with that arrangement anymore, not after what I had discovered. I called a local locksmith, an old friend from the neighborhood, and he arrived after dinner. He didn't ask questions, just nodded professionally, replaced every cylinder, and handed me a completely new set of keys. "Anyone giving you trouble, Catherine?" he asked, half joking. "Not yet," I replied, "but I prefer to stay ahead of potential problems." He smiled approvingly. Smart woman. I didn't inform anyone, not Serafina, not Christopher. Let them discover it the next time they attempted to enter uninvited with their fraudulent smiles and forged paperwork. Let them jiggle the door handle and realize it no longer responds to their touch. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea, my hands wrapped around the bone china mug like it was the only warm thing remaining in my universe. Not because of the temperature, it was mid-autumn and mild, but because of the Arctic chill that had crept into my life since Serafina entered it. I stared out the window, past the prize-winning gardens and the marble fountain my great-grandfather had imported from Italy, and I reflected on all the times I had chosen silence over self-defense, all the occasions I had made excuses for people who never deserved my consideration. Christopher was never a cruel child, just easily influenced. He followed charisma like a compass needle, and Serafina wore charm like expensive perfume. That soft, sweet tone, the carefully calculated compliments, the way she always offered to help with dinner, but somehow never quite made it to the actual preparation. The first time she visited, I remember her gliding through the house with her hand trailing along the carved banister, her eyes scanning the crown molding like a professional appraiser rather than a welcomed guest. I attributed it to curiosity, perhaps even appreciation for architectural beauty. Now, I understand better. She wasn't admiring my home. She was calculating her opportunity. What struck me most profoundly wasn't that Serafina attempted to steal what wasn't hers. It was how effortlessly Christopher allowed her to do it. It reminded me of someone else, years ago. Just after my husband died in that terrible accident, my brother offered to help manage the family properties. He said it would be easier with him listed on a few documents, just temporarily, just until I regained my emotional equilibrium. By the time I realized what he was orchestrating, he had liquidated half of what remained of our father's holdings and sold them without my knowledge. I never recovered those assets, and I never forgave myself for not recognizing the pattern sooner. That betrayal had a particular shape, a distinctive voice. It echoed now in Serafina's meticulously chosen words and Christopher's downcast eyes. I thought I had closed that chapter permanently, but betrayal doesn't fade. It simply changes names and faces. This time, however, I wasn't naive. I wasn't young, and I wasn't going to stand in the ashes apologizing for being burned. I had spent the last 30 years raising Christopher alone after the tragedy took his father. I sacrificed tremendously, not out of obligation, but out of love. True, stubborn, unconditional love, the kind that believes things will improve if you just hold on long enough. But even love has limits, and mine had just been reached. The following morning, I drove out to Westport, where the trees along the Sound were just beginning to transform into their autumn magnificence, their early colors trembling in the coastal breeze. I wasn't there for the scenery. I parked 2 blocks from an elegant brownstone and walked up the narrow brick steps to a door with a polished brass plaque, Judge Harrison Montgomery, retired. He opened the door before I could knock. "Well, look who the autumn wind delivered," he said, offering me a tired but genuine smile. Harrison had been my late husband's closest friend from Yale Law, a sharp man all intellect and caution who went on to spend 35 years on the federal bench. He retired 5 years ago and now spent most of his time providing free legal counsel to anyone wise enough to seek it. We sat on his enclosed back porch, the wicker furniture creaking beneath us as we drank bitter black coffee from his grandmother's china. I told him everything slowly, carefully, watching his eyes the way I used to watch Christopher's when I suspected deception. When I finished, Harrison didn't interrupt or offer hollow sympathy. He simply leaned back in his chair and said, "You've already accomplished more than most people would have the courage to attempt." "I want it completely locked down, Harrison," I said. "I want it so thoroughly protected that no matter what they try, they cannot touch this estate. Not during my lifetime, not after." He nodded thoughtfully. "Then we'll restructure your entire estate. You'll need trusts, and not just one for the house." I raised an eyebrow. "I assume you have substantial savings they don't know about." I smiled for the first time that morning. "Considerable assets." "Excellent," he said. "You'll need 2 separate trusts, one for the property, one for the liquid assets. And you'll need a completely new heir." I paused. "I have someone in mind." He didn't press for details. He never did. He just nodded and pulled out a yellow legal pad from the table drawer. scribbling in that small, efficient script I remembered from decades ago. By the time I left, the framework was solidly in place. A living trust for the house, protecting it from probate and legal challenges. A separate trust for the bulk of my financial estate, with a named successor completely unrelated to Christopher or Serafina. A clause disinheriting them both if they attempted any legal interference, and a sealed directive that wouldn't be revealed until after my death. That evening, I updated all my passwords, shredded old files, and burned a handful of letters, ones I had kept out of guilt, not affection. Then I retrieved a thick manila envelope from the back of my bedroom closet and wrote a single name on it in black ink: Lillian. My niece, my sister's daughter, raised across the country, now a pediatric surgeon in San Francisco and the only person who ever called simply to ask how I was sleeping. She didn't know it yet, but she was about to inherit far more than an estate. She was going to inherit peace, and in time, she would understand what that truly meant. It was late afternoon when Christopher arrived alone. I observed him through the living room window before he even knocked, standing on the front porch shifting his weight like a prep school boy about to confess to breaking something valuable. I opened the door, but didn't invite him inside. "Hello, Mother," he said softly. I stepped aside. He entered like he didn't recognize the place anymore, like something fundamental had shifted in the very atmosphere. I watched him glance around the room, the same room he had once filled with building blocks and spilled apple juice. Now he looked like a stranger visiting a museum. He didn't sit down. "Serafina believes it's time," he began. "You have this enormous estate, and it's simply too much for you to manage independently." I said nothing. He cleared his throat nervously. "We've located a really magnificent retirement community in Manhattan. It has exceptional amenities, full medical staff, concierge services. It's actually quite beautiful. We would handle the entire relocation, and Serafina even offered to personally decorate your new residence." I smiled at that. He interpreted it as encouragement and continued. "The thing is, Mother, if you're not receptive to this transition, we might need to reevaluate our entire relationship. It's difficult for Serafina to feel settled knowing this situation remains unresolved." "Unresolved," I repeated quietly. He hesitated. "She simply wants us to start building our future together, you understand, without having to navigate around this estate, this entire dynamic." I looked him directly in the eyes. "So if I remain here, you'll abandon me?" He looked away. "It's not like that. Say it clearly." He couldn't. He didn't have to. I had never seen him look so uncertain, so rehearsed and hollow. His words weren't his own. They were Serafina's, fed to him line by line, maybe even written out on paper beforehand. She was always meticulous about planning. I wanted to scream at him, to shake him until his teeth rattled, to ask him if he remembered who carried him through pneumonia, who worked 18-hour days after his father died just to maintain the mortgage payments, who hand-stitched his Halloween costumes because he despised the store-bought alternatives. But I didn't. "Christopher," I said quietly, "I'm not relocating." He sighed heavily. "Why not? What are you even preserving here? History, Christopher. You call it sentimentality. I call it earned." He stared at me as if I had just spoken in ancient Greek. "I'm not your burden," I said with surgical precision. "You don't get to decide when I disappear." He attempted one final manipulation. "I just don't want us to lose our connection." "You already have." His mouth opened, then closed again. I could see the internal conflict behind his eyes, a flicker of genuine guilt, a flash of the boy I had once raised with such devotion. But it passed quickly. He didn't embrace me goodbye. He didn't even thank me for the hospitality I hadn't offered. He simply left, and as I closed the door behind him, I engaged the deadbolt with finality. He wasn't my son anymore. He was Serafina's partner in strategy, and the moment he attempted to evict me from the home I had built, he became my opponent. What started as tea every Thursday at 3 p.m. became my quiet revolution. I met with several other women from our social circle, widows, retirees, 2 divorced professors who organized the library's rare book auction. Initially, we simply sipped Earl Grey and discussed aching joints and which specialty shops carried the finest imported goods. But word spreads quietly in communities like ours. By the second gathering, someone mentioned estate planning. "Don't leave anything unprotected," one woman said, her voice low and urgent. not even sentimental items. My sister's children fought over her Steinway for 3 years. Another woman added, make absolutely certain you have clauses preventing emotional manipulation. My nephew attempted to declare me mentally incompetent just to accelerate the trust distribution. I didn't ask for specific details. I didn't need to. We were all survivors of some form of inheritance ambush. They called it family planning. I called it slow motion theft. So I started bringing a notepad, asking careful questions. What precise language did you use in your trust regarding living heirs? How did you prevent them from challenging your competency? Which attorney didn't dismiss you when you said you were disinheriting your children? They answered with the wisdom of women who had learned to weaponize their experience. These elegant ladies with their pearl brooches and orthopedic shoes became my quiet defense committee. We traded samples of affidavits like family recipes. We discussed co-executors and irrevocable clauses and video documentation. They weren't just sipping tea. They were constructing legal fortresses out of cucumber sandwiches and bitter memories. One of them, Margaret, handed me a manila envelope tied with burgundy ribbon. It's what I provided my attorney, she said. The clause about barring anyone who attempts unauthorized property access after removal might prove useful. Another woman, Patricia, suggested a financial stipulation. Anyone who attempts premature asset distribution forfeits access to everything, even the life insurance policies, she said. Make it so devastating they develop frostbite, just contemplating the attempt. I admired Patricia's strategic thinking. At home, I updated my files, labeled each new entry, and began placing copies in 3 separate locations: safe deposit box, home safe, and one sealed envelope in my housekeeper's freezer. She laughed when I made the request. If anything happens to me, I said, retrieve it from behind the frozen berries. She tapped the freezer lid knowingly. Frozen backup, understood. That weekend, my niece Lillian visited for her monthly trip from the city. Still completing her surgical residency, still wearing the cashmere cardigan I had knitted her years earlier. She helped me organize some seasonal clothing, and then I casually showed her where the important documents were secured. Just in case, I said. She didn't ask why. She simply nodded, her fingers brushing over the edge of the folder with the quiet steadiness I remembered from my own grandmother. These weren't dramatic gestures. They were quiet turns of the key, because one thing I had learned from watching women lose everything was this: it never happens in a courtroom. It happens in kitchens, in smiles, in long silences that whisper, don't resist. Let go. Be grateful. And I wasn't letting go. I wasn't going to scream either. Several days later, my investigator Sebastian called after midnight. I have something you'll want to hear, he said. Can you meet me? We met in the parking garage beneath his office building. He handed me a flash drive and a detailed receipt. Serafina made a call from a cafe yesterday. Her Bluetooth malfunctioned, didn't disconnect properly. The entire conversation was captured. I didn't ask how he had obtained it. I simply accepted it. At home, I closed the blinds, prepared tea I wouldn't drink, and inserted the drive into my laptop. Her voice filled the room, not the voice she used with me, the one coated in honey and manufactured reverence. No, this voice was raw, unfiltered, authentic. She's so completely clueless, Serafina laughed, her tone dripping with contempt. Still talking about family recipes and photo albums. We'll liquidate that estate the second she signs. Christopher's already researching luxury properties in the Hamptons. I told him not to delay. We need to move quickly. There was a pause, then the muffled voice of someone else asking a question I couldn't distinguish. Serafina again, more confident this time. She won't fight us. She's too nice, too polite. She thinks being quiet makes her safe, but it makes her easy prey. The recording ended there, but that was sufficient. More than sufficient to transform sadness into something infinitely harder. I sat motionless for several minutes, hands folded, laptop humming softly. Then I reached into the side drawer of my desk and retrieved my documentation journal. November 18th, 11:47 p.m. Audio recording secured via private investigator. Serafina, she's so completely clueless. Will liquidate that estate the second she signs. Confirms intent to misrepresent, defraud, and remove without consent. I underlined liquidate that estate twice, then saved the file in triplicate. One copy into the safe, one into the bank box. One burned onto a CDI labeled in permanent ink. If they ever denied it, I had proof. The following morning, I played the recording for Victoria. She didn't even blink. "We file the cease and desist immediately," she said. "And if she so much as breathes near a title representative again, we'll pursue full civil prosecution." I nodded. "I also want to notify the media," I added quietly. "An anonymous tip about elder financial abuse, asset coercion. You understand the angle." Victoria's smile was razor thin. "You're not just fighting back, you're writing the ending." That evening, I didn't illuminate the porch lights. Let them stumble in darkness if they came. Let them wonder what I knew. Because that recording wasn't just evidence, it was a confession. And it made everything real, not just to me, but to the law. I played it once more before bed, not out of spite, but to remind myself what I was protecting. Not just my estate, but my voice, the one they thought would never speak. Serafina didn't see me as family. She didn't even see me as human. I was an obstacle with expensive taste, an inconvenience wrapped in tradition. And Christopher, he had delivered me to her like a gift. That realization settled into my bones like winter. I walked to the drawer where I kept my digital recorder, the one I had used that day they first arrived with their notary. I pressed record and quietly narrated what I had just heard, then saved the file to multiple drives. Then I sat down with my fountain pen and wrote what would become the most important letter of my life. As I sealed the envelope, I looked around my estate, the hand-carved banister, the silk wallpaper in the hallway, the sun-faded photograph of Christopher's 8th birthday. This house wasn't a prize to be won. It was a promise to be kept, and I would burn every bridge to protect it from their grasping hands. By Tuesday morning, my strategy was in full motion. I arrived at Victoria's office just as it opened. She was already reviewing the audio file on speakers positioned strategically behind her mahogany desk. She didn't look up when it played, just scribbled notes with a Mont Blanc pen that needed no sharpening. When it concluded, she clicked the file closed with finality. "That's more than plenty," she said. She didn't mean emotionally, she meant legally. We drafted the cease and desist that morning, using formal language so precise it could cut glass. Addressed not just to Serafina, but to the real estate agent who had taken her fraudulent calls. Victoria ensured we included explicit language about impersonation, misrepresentation, and pending legal review. "We're not accusing them yet," she explained. "We're warning them." "But the next step? Injunction, court order, possibly criminal charges," I finished. She looked up approvingly. "I also want to notify the county registrar," I added, "just in case she attempts to circumvent official paperwork." Victoria's smile was surgical in its precision. I signed those documents that afternoon. That evening, I mailed 2 items, the cease and desist, and an anonymous tip to the Hartford Courier about elder housing pressure in Connecticut's wealthiest suburbs. No names, just a quiet story suggestion. The subject line read, "How family love becomes real estate leverage." I wasn't hiding anymore. I was repositioning shadows. Meanwhile, I asked Sebastian to prepare the final version of the trust we had originally planned to file later. I had wanted to wait, to hold it close until the perfect moment, but now I didn't need time. I needed absolute finality. The following day, I called Lillian and asked her to visit immediately. She arrived with fresh sourdough bread and an expression of deep concern. I led her to the kitchen and handed her a sealed envelope with her name inscribed in calligraphy on the front. "If anything ever happens, a hospital stay, a sudden emergency, open this immediately." She nodded seriously. I told her where the additional copies were hidden, where the safe deposit box key lived, where the code to the home safe was buried in an old cookbook between the pages for lemon meringue pie. She didn't ask questions, just held the envelope against her chest and said, "I've got you, Aunt Catherine." I nodded. I know, because Serafina had a mouth, but Lillian had a memory and a heart that couldn't be purchased. That evening, I returned home, poured a glass of vintage Bordeaux, and opened my laptop. The cease and desist had already been signed for. The realtor had replied within 2 hours. "Apologies for the confusion. We were under the impression the inquiry was legitimate. We have immediately halted all action regarding this property." One down. The local newspaper hadn't responded yet, but that didn't matter. Because the next time Christopher and Serafina knocked on my door, they wouldn't find a compliant widow. They would find a sheriff and a court order and the woman they thought would never fight back. I left every light in the house blazing that evening just in case they drove by. I wanted them to see that I was awake, alert, and absolutely ready. They returned on a Thursday, same fraudulent notary, same smugly confident expression on Serafina's face, same oversized manila envelope. But this time there was someone else standing directly behind me in the marble foyer, Deputy Richardson from the county sheriff's office, a tall, soft-spoken man with a badge I had requested through proper legal channels. I didn't open the security screen immediately. I allowed Serafina to perform her entire charade through the reinforced glass. "We have all the final documentation prepared," she announced with theatrical brightness. "Figured we'd handle this smoothly, no complications. We even brought a premium pen for the signatures." Christopher stood rigidly behind her, his eyes fixed on his handmade Italian shoes. The notary unfolded his clipboard with practiced efficiency. That was my cue. I opened the door slowly, just enough to step outside into the autumn air. I didn't invite them inside. I didn't even acknowledge the notary's existence. I simply handed Serafina a thick envelope, official, and weighted with consequence. "This is for you," I said with perfect calm. She accepted it, confusion flickering across her carefully maintained features. "What's this?" "That," I said clearly, "is a formal court order and cease and desist directive. You are hereby permanently banned from any legal or financial action regarding this property, effective immediately." The notary froze like a statue. Serafina blinked rapidly, her brain struggling to process this unexpected development. What?" Deputy Richardson stepped forward, his voice low but unmistakably authoritative. "Ma'am, you've been officially served. Any further attempts to represent this property on behalf of Mrs. Ashford will be considered fraudulent and reported directly to the district attorney." Christopher's head shot up with whiplash speed. "You called the police on us," he snapped, his voice cracking through that thin veneer of prep school composure. "No," I said with surgical precision. "I called the courts. And they answered." Serafina's perfectly manicured hands trembled slightly as she opened the envelope, flipping through pages of legal documentation she clearly couldn't comprehend. "This is a misunderstanding," she stammered. "We were attempting to help." "I don't require your assistance," I interrupted. "And I certainly don't need your notary." The notary quietly gathered his materials and retreated down the steps without uttering a single word, apparently recognizing legal quicksand when he saw it. Christopher looked at me then, really looked, and for the first time I witnessed something I hadn't seen in him in years. Not anger, not embarrassment, terror. "You don't mean this," he whispered. I meant every syllable. Serafina's voice transformed into something shrill and desperate. "You're destroying us after everything we've done for you." Deputy Richardson stepped forward again. "I think that's quite enough." Serafina opened her mouth to protest further, but I raised my hand just slightly, and she stopped mid-breath. "Leave," I said, my voice low and deadly calm, "before this becomes something uglier than paperwork." They didn't argue. Not really. They turned, walked down the steps with whatever dignity they could salvage, and got into their car. Serafina slammed the passenger door so hard I thought the window might shatter. Christopher looked back once, but I had already closed mine. I stood in the foyer for a long time afterward, the court orders still in my hand, now just a backup copy. The house was quiet, peaceful, completely mine again. They didn't wait long. Not even 3 hours after the confrontation, my phone rang. Blocked number. I didn't answer. Then came the pounding on the door. Not knocking, pounding. I opened it slowly, chain still latched. It was Christopher alone, his eyes red not from crying, but from panic. "Mother, what is this?" he demanded, holding up the envelope as if it were written in flames. "What is this supposed to prove?" "It proves," I said calmly, "that I see you now. Clearly." He shoved the envelope back through the gap. "You're being manipulated. You're paranoid." Serafina was trying to help. She impersonated me to a real estate agent. She didn't sign anything. She tried. Silence. Then, softer. "We thought you'd want to secure your future." I stepped back, unlatched the chain, opened the door fully. In my hand, I held another envelope, this one cream-colored, embossed, heavy with finality. I opened it slowly and removed the first page of my revised will, the notarized copy. My name at the top. Christopher's name nowhere to be found. "You're no longer a beneficiary," I said. His breath caught like a fishhook in his throat. "You don't mean this." "I absolutely do." He blinked as if I had physically slapped him. "I raised you," I continued, stepping closer. "For 30 years I gave you everything I possessed, my time, my strength, my silence. And you repaid that with strategy, with schemes." His voice cracked. I was scared. I was too, I whispered. But I didn't use that fear to dismantle the only home I've ever known. He looked at the marble floor. "Please." I shook my head slowly. "You thought kindness meant weakness. That just because I didn't scream, I wouldn't notice when I was being cornered. I wasn't trying to corner you." "Then why?" I asked, stepping even closer. "Did you stand behind her in absolute silence while she discussed removing me from my own home?" No answer. None was possible. I handed him the will. "This is the new reality. You don't inherit this estate. You don't inherit anything. You inherit what you earned, and what you earned is absence." He couldn't speak, not even when Serafina appeared behind him halfway down the walkway, shouting, "She's bluffing. She won't follow through." I looked at Serafina once, just once, and said loud enough for the entire neighborhood to hear, "This house is no longer in my name." She froze like a deer in headlights. Christopher turned sharply. "What?" I smiled faintly. "It belongs to a historical preservation trust now. Protected, filed, and permanent. No sales, no inheritance, no access. Ever." Serafina's face twisted into something unrecognizable. Christopher turned back to me, stunned. "You gave it away?" "No," I said softly. "I saved it." Then I closed the door, locked it, and let them scream at wood and stone that would never yield. The next morning it was Christopher who returned, alone again. No shouting this time. No fraudulent smiles. No notary. Just a man who looked like he hadn't slept. His shoulders slumped, as if they had been carrying lies for too long. I saw him through the window as he stood on the porch, looking smaller somehow, diminished. He knocked once, softly, the knock of a boy who used to believe I would always answer. I opened the door. He didn't try to enter. He just looked at me with eyes rimmed with the kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from lack of sleep. "I didn't know she was going that far," he said, his voice hoarse with something that might have been genuine remorse. I said nothing. I thought. I thought it would be simpler, cleaner. We'd convince you, help you downsize, make the money work for both of us. I raised an eyebrow. "Both of us?" He looked away. "I was scared," he said again. "Scared of debt, of responsibility, of being trapped in a life I didn't choose." "And you thought I'd just surrender mine?" I asked. He shook his head slowly. "No, I thought you wouldn't fight." That made me pause, because he was absolutely right. He thought I wouldn't fight, and for the longest time, I hadn't. Not when his father left debts scattered like landmines throughout my life. Not when bills accumulated while I worked double shifts to keep Christopher safe upstairs. Not even when Serafina first started smiling too widely and asking too many questions about property values. I had been quiet until I wasn't. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. "She's gone," he said. "Packed everything and went to her sister's in Newport. Said I destroyed it, that you were supposed to be the easy part." I stared at him. "She loved my money more than me." He flinched. "I know, and you allowed her." He looked up then, finally meeting my eyes. I did. I waited. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I don't expect anything. I needed you to know." I nodded once. "You only miss me now that I said no." He opened his mouth, then closed it. I stepped outside and pulled the door shut behind me, careful not to let him see the tremor in my fingers. "You're my son, Christopher. That will always be true. But I raised you to be better than this, and if you choose to become that man again, do it without expecting a reward." He nodded. "I'm not angry," I said. "I'm free." He didn't ask to come inside. He didn't ask about the house. He simply stepped off the porch and walked to his car, his shoulders carrying a different weight than when he had arrived. I watched until the car disappeared down the tree-lined street, and then I turned, walked inside, and locked the door with a peace that didn't come from victory, but from letting the fantasy die. Because love without respect isn't love, it's a transaction waiting to expire, and mine finally had. 6 months later, I received a letter. Not from Christopher, but from a law firm in Manhattan. Serafina was challenging the trust, claiming emotional manipulation and undue influence. She wanted half the estate's value as compensation for emotional damages. I called Victoria immediately. "Can she do this?" I asked. Victoria laughed, actually laughed. "She can try. But remember that recording? The one where she called you clueless and discussed liquidating your property. That's going to be Exhibit A in court." The case was dismissed with prejudice. Serafina was ordered to pay court costs and legal fees. She never contacted me again. Christopher sent a single text message 3 months after that. "I'm sorry. I understand now." I never replied. Some apologies come too late to bridge the chasm they helped create. But here's what I learned from this experience, and why I'm sharing this story with you today. Kindness is not weakness, but silence in the face of manipulation is surrender. Trust your instincts, especially when they're screaming. Document everything, because memory fades, but evidence endures. And most importantly, never let anyone convince you that your peace is worth less than their greed. My estate remains in that trust, protected forever. When I pass, it will go to Lillian, who calls every Sunday just to ask how I'm sleeping. She doesn't want anything from me except my happiness. That's the difference between love and strategy. Real love doesn't come with a price tag. If you've lived long enough, you know this feeling, the moment when you realize that the people you trusted most were the ones planning your downfall. But you also know this: you're stronger than they think, smarter than they assume, and infinitely more valuable than they deserve. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even, it's getting free.